For 70 years, across the USSR, organized religion was banned. Religious Jews were hunted and persecuted. Under the communist regime, in a land spanning 11 time zones, with the highest Jewish population in the world, thousands of shuls, schools, and mikvahs were shut down. 8 million Jews were being choked off from the heritage of their fathers. On a dark night in Moscow in the winter of 1924, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, the 6th Rebbe of Lubavitch, made a covenant with a group of young men. They vowed to fight to the end to preserve their religion for the Jews of the Soviet Union, even if it meant losing their lives. Under the Rebbe's leadership, an organized underground of hundreds of cheder elementary schools, yeshivas, and mikvahs sprung up from St. Petersburg in the west to Tashkent in the east. These dedicated men and women managed to keep the spark of Yiddishkeit alive in hundreds of towns and cities across the land. Communists persecuted, chased, and harassed the Rebbe and his operatives. Often within days, a new mikveh would be filled with cement. A report would arrive of a teacher sent to the firing squad, his young students sent to Siberia. But there always seemed to be another Hussein ready to fill his shoes. Through the years of communism, hundreds of Hasidic activists were executed. Thousands more were arrested and sent to Siberia for years of hard labor. In 1927, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak himself was arrested and sentenced to capital punishment. Through the intervention of the governments of the United States, Germany, and Latvia, and petitions signed by hundreds of thousands of Jews across the Soviet Union, the sentence was commuted. The Rebbe was banished from Russia. In 1939, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak, father of the 7th Rebbe, was imprisoned in Dnipropetrovsk, Ukraine, for his counter-revolutionary work. Among other crimes, he had personally stood up to Premier Stolypin and refused to follow the Premier's orders to certify government-baked matzahs as kosher for Passover. Rabbi Levi Yitzchak was exiled to a remote area of Kazakhstan. He passed away of his suffering in exile in 1944. He was buried 2,000 miles from his home in Almaty, Kazakhstan. In 1950, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, at 48 years old, became the Rebbe. Under his guidance, the struggle intensified. Not a day would go by when the Rebbe would not struggle for the Jews of Russia.
והנידוחים בארץ מצרים, דאבלי vervogelte Jiden, ובפרט die was gefunden sich nachher Mosach Abarzel, was nicht über sehr Schuld, aber sie noch nicht sicher gewesen zu der vollsten Möglichkeit von lernenden Teilen und bekam sein Mitzvah bis ihm auf
The Rebbe toiled endlessly for their physical and spiritual well-being. He sent couples posing as tourists, as clandestine shluchim, bringing strength and determination to his Russian underground. The couples would memorize hundreds of names and addresses. Russian border guards were left scratching their heads by Hasidic couples who would travel to Russia for a 2-week stay, laden down with kosher salami and Jewish books and films. The humanitarian aid was used to feed Jews in cities and shtetl across the land. The shluchim smuggled out film strips, where Jews would request the Rebbe's blessings.
But er heet Yankiv, Ik wil beten als de Rebbe soll Rachmon haben auf unsere Kinder.
Ich will bitten der Rebbe, soll beten, die alle Iden, welche sitzen in Wet Sohar.
Rebbe, благодарю тебя за просьбу, которую ты исполнил, которую я говорил в прошлый раз.
The Rebbe would debrief the shluchim for hours on end, often weeping upon hearing the reports of physical and spiritual persecution. Perhaps more than anything else, the message the shluchim brought the Jews of Russia was that someone on the other side of the curtain remembered and cared. Someone would not sleep and would not rest until they would be freed from their bondage. In 1989, the shackles began to break open with the fall of communism and perestroika. Immediately, the Rebbe began to dispatch shluchim to bring Judaism above ground, with restriction on religion being officially released. The ashes, glowing for 70 years, finally burst into flame. The warmth of Judaism began to glow for the millions of Jewish men, women, and children across Russia who didn't even know the meaning of the word Jew. Schools, shuls, mikvahs, and community centers began to spring up. Once again, children were laughing in the hallways of Jewish schools. An entire Jewish infrastructure has sprung up from the embers which were kept alive for 70 years.
The first holiday, we put a small ad in the newspaper. We thought that maybe 200 people would come. 600 people showed up. My wife and I decided that we're moving here for sure. There are people here. There are youth here. There's a future.
I understood long ago that we have to make a change. Enough hiding, enough being ashamed of our Judaism. My husband also, at the beginning he didn't go, now he goes to the synagogue.
In 1932, they took away our synagogue and made it into a factory, a textile factory named Stalin. Now they're giving us back our synagogue.
There used to be about 40 synagogues. There were mikvahs, cheders. 80% of the people were Jewish. When we came here, there was almost nothing. Now, we're rebuilding the synagogue.
Last year we opened up the first Jewish school in the whole Ural and Siberia region. We have over here a place right next door that we're planning to build a mikveh. We already bought a house.
The Jewish revival in Kiev recently received a tremendous boost. Thousands of adults participated in study days, and many others come to classes in Jewish heritage.
Got a young couple who's just been married a year or two, and they pick themselves up with their Chaya Mushka or the Menachem Mendel. They may or may not speak the language to begin with, and they arrive there and there's absolutely nothing there. And they go basically as pioneers to rebuild what once was a glorious Jewish life there.
On Hanukkah and Purim, usually we have many thousands of people. Our goal is to get young people actively involved in Jewish life.
Ladies and gents, good morning. Good to see you all. And hope you enjoyed this interesting film that we just watched. Let me just stop the presentation. There we go. And what was interesting to me is to see Tamara and Shlomo Kirsch join just before their son showed up on the video. So Tamara, you once spoke with us before about your experience, about the life your children have in the former Soviet Union. And as one whose own father lived there, and I've been there twice, once to Russia, another time to Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan was exactly 2 years ago. Russia was about 20 years ago. But the experience I've seen, the growth, the rejuvenation of Jewish life in the former Soviet Union is quite impressive. It's incredible. To know what my father endured there in the 1930s, to know what he experienced there in the 40s through the war and everything else that was going on, to hear firsthand stories from my grandmother of what it was like growing up in communist Russia, it's very impressive to see the difference, the metamorphosis, the transition, the change and transformation that they've experienced there. It's very impressive. And I wanted to take you a little bit back in the history. I'm going to go back to 1927. My grandmother was about 15 years old then, and she told us stories of life. She remembers exactly what happened. It was the time when Joseph Stalin was the new leader of the Soviet Union. We're talking about a few years, I guess, after Lenin's death. And Stalin very aggressively embarked on this really ruthless campaign to root out all religion from the former Soviet Union. In the words of, unfortunately, a phrase coined by a Marxist Jew named Karl Marx, they said that religion was the opium of all the mass, the opium of the masses. And they basically tried to eliminate all religious practice, which of course was a terrible problem for us Jewish people who want to practice our religion in freedom. And any slight thought of revolt of anyone who was in any way threatening the fiber of their beliefs, that's it. They were cut down, they were executed. You saw parts on this little video, just a little bit. This is, by the way, the shorter version of a much longer video about the rejuvenation of Jewish life in Russia. And during those years, again, I could only tell you what I heard from my father, what I heard from my grandmother, and what I grew up with. Many Jews, the Chabad community, Chabad was in Russia. So these were the people who lived there, who experienced it. My mother-in-law, bless her, Batya's mom, has been to Russia numerous times during the 70s and 80s on missions that she was sent by the Rebbe. He would send shluchim undercover during the communist era to go on missions to bring Yiddishkeit to the Jews who were left behind. So Chabad certainly kept Judaism alive in Russia during those difficult times. But the story I wanted to share with you today, as today is the anniversary of the liberation of the previous Rebbe, we're talking 1927, quite a few years ago, right? What is that, 94 years ago? And it was, I don't know how long before, but several weeks before today. I think it must have been just after Shavuos. So I think it was early June 1927. The previous Rebbe was arrested. I mean, just to paint the picture of that time, just to think of what goes on, what went on, we talk about the atrocities committed during the Second World War, during the Holocaust, where 6 million of our people were brutally murdered, where millions of others. Do you know that during the height of the communist regime, that Stalin was responsible for the murder of somewhere between 20 and 50 million people? I mean, I don't know the accurate numbers, but these are the numbers that I've heard from historians. And many, many Jews were primary targets. Many Hasidim, many Chabad rabbis were executed by the Russians. There was a whole special government organization called the Yivisektia. We talked about the Yivisektia previously. My grandmother told me many things about them. The Yivisektia, literally, it means they were a Jewish section of the Communist Party that were totally anti any religious behavior. And somehow they bought into this idea of the paradise of communism. And what's ironic is that Stalin actually tried to create a Jewish state in Russia. There was what was that area called? The Pale of Settlement. But then they actually created an area where they thought they would make like a paradise. And Yiddish was the spoken language. You could still go there today. But Jews and anyone who revolted, I talk about Jewish people only because that's what I'm familiar with. But there were many, many, many people. Anyone was sent to the gulags. They were shot. They were thrown into Siberian prisons. They had to work there for who knows how many years to that was life. You had to be in the gulag in Siberia where the weather was frigid. You think it's cold here in Johannesburg today. Just experience what Siberia could have been like. And so the story of today, didn't I say I was going to tell you the story about today? I keep on giving you little intros. The Frierdiker Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, you saw in the video, he spearheaded an underground Jewish network, a resistance to Stalin's ideological final solution. Unlike Hitler, Yamach Shema, who just killed Jews for being Jewish, Stalin had a different kind of plan, which was to eliminate religion within Jews. And I could tell you, I had Russian classmates who came to the US, to New York when we were kids. They were, they came from communism. They knew very little about their Yiddishkeit because that's what happened in Russia. They couldn't practice religion. Whatever they were able to do was underground. It was secretive. It was very difficult for them to actually live Jewishly there in Russia. And what did Chabad do? Chabad set up a whole underground network of yeshivas, of mikvahs, of shachtim, of butchers. My great-grandfather was a butcher, was a shochet. It's a very interesting story that in itself, because he was told by the previous Rebbe's father, known as the Rebbe Rashab, and he passed away in 1920 when communism began. He actually he moved from Lubavitch, where Chabad was headquartered for over a century, to a city called Rostov. I have a friend who was with me in 2002 here at the yeshiva in Linksfield. His name is Rabbi Chaim, and he is the rabbi in Rostov today. Very vibrant Jewish community once again. It's amazing to see what's going on there. So he went there and he passed away, unfortunately, in Rostov. And his son, the previous Rebbe, took over. The story I was going to tell you about the previous Rebbe's father was that he told my great-grandfather, my grandmother's father, to be a shochet. And my Zayda said, I don't think I'm God-fearing enough. And the rabbi said to him, that's why I want you. Who do I want? Somebody who thinks he is God-fearing. So that story always stood out to me about why my great-grandfather wound up becoming a shochet, a ritual slaughterer, a ritual butcher, whatever you might call that in English properly. But that was what he had. He basically pulled together a loyal army of Hasidim, called them Armeya Admura, the army of the Admor. Admor is an acronym for Adonenu, Moreinu Rabbeinu, our master, our teacher, our Rebbe. And this was the amazing underground network of bustling Jewish activity, all underground. They had schools, like I mentioned, and shuls, because it was illegal. The Russians allowed like one shul in some cities, in the big cities, to show the world, no, Judaism, you're free to practice, but it was under their conditions. The yeshivas, this was all a whole underground network, and people were able to learn. And that's how my father, growing up in Moscow and then moving to Samarkand, which is Uzbekistan, it was all underground. It was all illegal. It was all hidden. Imagine, illegal. You have to go to a school illegally. Just put that into context. Just try to think what that means. Any books they had to publish, all underground, all illegally. Just put that concept into mind. You want to eat kosher food. It had to be done illegally, surreptitiously, because it was all illegal to be doing these types of things. If one teacher was caught, another teacher took his place. So there were Hasidim constantly. And we're talking about from 1917 all the way to 1991. Throughout that whole period, that Chabad kept Jewish life going during those difficult times. But I think the most difficult period was the 1920s and 1930s. My father was a child in the 30s, described to me how difficult it was. But I think the more difficult time was very likely like this period when the previous Rebbe was arrested. And what was his accusation? What were the grounds, the premise for his arrest? Was for this underground network that he was spearheading. And so I was reading to my kids the other night the story of his arrest and liberation, the heroic struggle that he endured. He was brutally taken from his home. It was one midnight in June, I think that's what it said, and incarcerated in one of the most horrendous prisons of the Soviet hell. It was called Spalerka. The description, he writes, he was very descriptive in his diary, but you don't need to read his diary to know how they tormented their prisoners, what they did to them, the fact that he even survived it. I told you last week that they threw him down a set of metal stairs, and the belt buckle got stuck in him and he was bleeding nearly to death. And in fact, they gave him a capital sentence. The death sentence he was meant to be executed. There was major pressure from abroad, from the USA, from the president at the time, President Hoover in the United States, who interceded on his behalf, and they had major diplomatic intercedents. And the death sentence was then converted from death to a 10-year sentence. Millions of people died in it was an exile sentence. He was sent to a place called Kostroma. It was a far-off place, like basically far out, living in unbearable conditions. In fact, his mechutin and his cousin, who was the father of the Rebbe, you saw in the video, his name was Rabbi Yitzchak Schneerson, he was sent off also to exile for the same activity he was doing not in Russia, but in Ukraine. He was the chief rabbi of Ukraine, and he was sent off to Uzbekistan, where he passed away. And that's why I went there 2 years ago to be there for the anniversary of his passing. I gave a full report back then. Maybe as we get closer to his yard site, which is going to be next month, I could share with you more insights and teachings and a little bit more about my experience then. But today I want to remain focused on the story of the previous Rebbe. And what happened eventually was they commuted his exile sentence and his, it was first execution, then from the death sentence changed to exile, and eventually with all the diplomatic pressure, today, in 1927, he was fully liberated and was set free, but he was actually, what's the word for it? Expelled from Russia, not allowed to ever return, which he didn't. And of course, left behind was his library with all of his precious books, manuscripts, collections. Till this very day, Russia's been giving a very hard time for Chabad. They came up with a compromise, which I don't want to say is acceptable. I mean, from my perspective, at least we have something. Chabad in New York is fighting to still get it returned. But at least for now, Russia, you can see how far they've come. The library is now housed at the Chabad headquarters in Moscow. And if anyone wants to read these manuscripts, to see the books and whatever else was part of the previous Rebbe's possessions that were recovered, they're available at the Chabad headquarters in Moscow. You could go see it, but you can't move it. You can't take it. Of course, Chabad would rather it be in New York, where Chabad relocated to. But this whole story, despite how they tortured and beat him, and I think he was basically somewhat paralyzed from that point. He was physically tortured and beaten. You read his memoirs, you read the story. It's a whole book about that period of when he was in Russia, when he was incarcerated, what they did to him. And when they finally expelled him, he basically was wheelchair bound from that point and passed away 23 years later in New York in 1950. But he accomplished a lot during that time, did a lot for Jews in Russia, and did a lot for Jews in the free world. And of course was succeeded by our Rebbe, who said he was going to reverse everything that Hitler Yamach Shemo tried to eliminate us with hate. The Rebbe was going to find every Jew and shower them with love. And the Rebbe's project wasn't just for Jews. The Rebbe's project was for all of mankind. And, there's so much that we know what the Rebbe did and achieved, But here we're talking about his father-in-law, who today is his holiday. Today it's a 2-day festival because yesterday was the day that they said he could go, and today is the day that he actually was released. So it's a major, tremendous festival. You think about the miracle of his survival. It's hard for us to relate to it today, where, thank God, we live in a much freer society. But, far less significant activities in Soviet Russia. People, activists were murdered for crimes that were, so to say, much smaller than his. And he was sentenced to death. The fact that he stood up as a lone figure to this mighty, brutal, and ruthless, mighty power, and he survived it, and sowed the seeds of Jewish life in the Soviet Union for the following 7 decades, was nothing short of an outstanding miracle. If anyone here knows people who survived it, and maybe Mrs. Kirsch will share with us a little bit more about what it's like for your own children and grandchildren living there today, how different it is. Even today, the world is still intimidated by Russia. Don't mess with Vladimir Putin, right? People dare to stand up to the government. Putin runs a tight ship there. I don't know how many years he's been in control. I could tell you when I was in Russia 20 years ago and when I was there 2 years ago, the same feeling, he's running a tight ship in that country. But in those days, no one would even dream of resistance. And yet, wonder of wonder, one lone Hasidic Rebbe created a small army of rabbis and rebbitzins around him, and they stood up. These brave men and women, they stood up to the most evil and cruel superpower in human history. Just read a little bit about, I'm sure many of you know what was going on during the past decade. Or what am I saying, decade? Century. The past decade has been paradise compared to then. And so today it's worthwhile to celebrate that. And what I want to share with you in our short remaining time for today is a little bit, just an excerpt from the previous Rebbe's diary about his description of this day. Because when he left, in the prison cell, he was in constant torture. But I think it was 5 weeks or so. But when he came out, he wrote a very detailed diary of his experiences. And in this profoundly dramatic and historic first-person description, he graphically documented the cold truth about the cynical Stalinist facade of religious tolerance that they pretended to show the world. He described that midnight arrest and all the details. I was reading it to my kids the other night. It is gruesome. The intimidation, the interrogations that he underwent, the incarceration in that Russia without trial, the humiliation that took place in prison, it was routine. What they did to him there, they said, here you're a prisoner, you'll learn what life is like. The torture of dissidents, describing what he hears, the shouts, the screams, the gunshots in all the rooms nearby. The firing squads just cutting down countless innocent people, men and women. It's a chilling, remarkable account of what it was like then. And I think, if you're looking for a nice, interesting read, you could actually find it on Chabad.org. It's called An Account of the Imprisonment. It's, I think the Hebrew is called the Kutei Deburim, but there's a few other versions. You could read a book called The Heroic Struggle. Another book is called The Prince in Prison. And these are all part of his diary that were compiled with various of his teachings and talks and excerpts, just describing what it was like back then and getting a glimpse of that story. And at one point in his account, in general, he writes very prolifically. It's in Hebrew and Yiddish, but you could read the English translation, like I said, in The Heroic Struggle or Prince in Prison. he describes the complete physical and psychological subjugation of the prisoners in that prison. It was called Shpalerik. It was in Leningrad. Let me just read to you something here that he says. He says, since the cells have no locks, it is only the routine announcements that give notion of the time. In summer, prisoners are awakened between 6:30 and 7 a.m. Bread is distributed at 7:30, and lights go off at 10:30 p.m. He described the message is clear. It's a prison, a Soviet prison. They don't want you to feel any sense of freedom. You're made to feel that you own nothing. You have no rights, not even the right of knowing what time it is. And he continues in his diary with these words. He says, and this is something we read in the Parsha last week, and I want to just share this insight with you because I think it's a profound message and lesson we could all take. The Medrash teaches, from where did Moshe Rabbeinu, when he was on top of Mount Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights after receiving the Torah, how did he know when it was day, when it was night? Says the Medrash, when he heard the angel saying, Kadosh, we say in our davening, Kadosh, 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 holy, holy, holy. That's when he knew that it's day. And when he heard the angel saying the words, Baruch, blessed, Baruch Hashem, Kadosh, 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 Hashem, Tzvos Melech Eretz Kavod, Baruch, Kavod, Hashem Imkama. When he hears the words, blessed is Hashem's holy presence, then he knew it was night. And this is what he writes in his diary, quoting this Medrash. Now, very interesting that he puts this comparison here in the diary, describing his incarceration in the Shpalerik prison, one of the most fearsome prisons in Stalin's hell. Few people made it out of that cursed place. You read about Shpalerik. The mere mention of its name was sufficient to send shivers down your spine. The Rebbe described it. And here he's telling us how he has no clock. He doesn't know the time of the day. He's talking about how just the basic human conditions, everything he's experiencing, there's no sense of humanity, of liberty. Not only is there not, it's not the free world where you could do what you want to. Forget about moving about freely. But he's not even given the opportunity, the dignity to know when it's day or night. He's stuck in a dungeon, no clock. It's not your business what time it is. What does that remind him of? How did he describe it in his diary? Of Moshe sitting on the peak of Mount Sinai, learning Torah from the mouth of Almighty God himself, and not knowing day from night because he finds himself in this transcendent space, receiving the Torah on Mount Sinai. You think if there's ever a free man, it's Moshe. He's on top of the mountain, liberated from any human constraints. Doesn't even need to eat or drink. He's like an angel up there. It's like two diametrically opposed realities. Here, the previous Rebbe is in prison, being tortured, beaten, describing the hell he's enduring there. And what does it remind him of? Of Moshe Mount Sinai. And to think that, it's just a very interesting comparison that he makes. And the Rebbe once spoke about this in one of his talks. And he discussed the idea that whatever we endure here in this world, we read in the Parsha last week about the snakes, right? Remember that whenever there was a plague, there was an epidemic, I think it's relevant today as we're going through our third wave here in South Africa, particularly in Gauteng, where, have you seen the numbers, what they look like this morning? How many people are unfortunately contracting COVID, testing negative, not feeling well? Too many people I know personally in that state. And there's a very powerful lesson I think we could take from this little entry in his diary, where he talks about the torture, the tormenting him in the prison that reminds him of Moshe on Mount Sinai. Because it's not just him, like we said yesterday, every story in the Torah has got to be a lesson for all of us. So when we look at this anecdote, this biblical story about the snakes. The snakes, have you ever been bitten by a snake? And I'm not just talking about a literal snake, right? Life, somehow, we have poisonous snakes. We have situations that are unpleasant, right? Whatever it might be. Think of whatever torture, difficulty you might be going through. And lots of people have gone through difficult times. These are difficult times for many people. So can we expect more? Like, what can you do in these situations? Can you find a deeper meaning to the suffering, to the struggles, to the challenges, to the difficulties that we're experiencing? And perhaps that's what he was telling us in the story. God tells Moshe in last week's parsha to make a serpent. Remember that story? Put it on top of the pole. And this is what the medical fraternity, if you look at my car, as a Hatzalah medic, I have that image of the snake because that has been adopted from the Torah as the medical fraternity's logo. And it comes from the parsha where God tells Moshe, make a serpent and put it on top of that pole, and whoever gets bitten should look at it and will live. What's the message? And I think it goes back to the story of the previous Rebbe in his prison cell, reminded of Moshe Mount Sinai. In the story of the parsha, where the people are experiencing the snakes and scorpions, and God saying to Moshe, put the snake on top of the pole. What's the idea? What's the key to healing? What is the Torah telling us? Yes, we face difficult challenges. We can't always run away from it. COVID's here. How are we going to run away? We could try to keep ourselves safe. But let me tell you, many people who have been tested positive told me they were isolating, they were hiding, they weren't like me running all over the place. And maybe the thing is we can't run away from the snake. Maybe what comes our way is part of our destiny. And therefore, God says to Moshe, don't run from the snake. Look at it. But where is it? Where does God tell Moshe to put this snake? On top of the pole. You're looking up to it. You're looking above. Not the way it is affecting us just here now, but looking above, realizing the good, the bad, the ugly. It all comes from the same Almighty God. Everything that happens in our world, we have to realize where it comes from. And the truth is, everything we experience, we could see it from two dimensions. We could see it from our concrete, earthly perspective, or we could see it from a higher, a more sublime vantage point. We could see it from God's perspective. There's the snake here, and there's the very snake, the very same snake up there. I could experience my challenges, my struggles, my difficulties, right? The way I am, the way they're giving me a hard time, the way I can't get by them. But I could take these very same struggles and I could look at them in a different way. I could see it from a more elevated point of view. I'm not saying the circumstances change necessarily, right? But I'm giving meaning and significance to them. From a downer perspective, what do? They're curveballs, they're challenges, they're struggles. I was sitting in a meeting yesterday with a particular retirement home that I'm trying to help out with just their situation there. And they tell me, these struggles. And I said, no, these are opportunities. And the guy liked it. It was an Afrikaans fellow. And, you're right, opportunities. And if we look at it as opportunities, we see that perspective, the way God sees these, why are they happening to us in our lives? And I can't tell you the answer, but I think we can all give ourselves a little bit meaning. Whenever a crisis, whenever a difficulty comes our way, are we just going to be miserable, or could we allow ourselves to discover something deeper? And it's not always easy. It certainly isn't. But certainly when I was able to find meaning in my struggles, certainly it helped me grow and become better from it. It helped us come out of those difficult situations. They forced us to ask, who am I, right? what really matters to me, what's really important to me. Hopefully, it moves us from the surface to the depths where I discover the strengths I didn't know I had. Maybe it gave me a new clarity of purpose that perhaps I wasn't paying attention to before. And I think that's the story, why the previous Rebbe puts that in his diary, is while he's going through the hell of the torture in that prison cell, he's telling himself, yes, he's sitting there in a Shpalerka prison in Leningrad, he's being tortured, what they did to him there, the unbearable pain that he suffered. And yet, he doesn't despair, he doesn't give up. He was sentenced to death. He's sitting in a prison cell with no windows. He describes no clock, no way to tell the time. He was stripped from all his humanness, his dignity, his very sense of selfhood, as he described in the diary. But he didn't look at it just in the reality of the moment. Because the reality of the moment is that there were venomous snakes, the serpents that we read in the Parsha, that were trying to get him. Or as he experienced, in reality, the Yivaseks, his own fellow Jews, had turned on him. But instead, what did the Rebbe do? He looked up, took the message from our Parsha. And what did he see? He saw Moshe there on top of the mountain, called up by Hashem, learning the Torah with God, not knowing the difference between day and night, unless the angels would give him that information. That was the Rebbe's message. He wasn't naive. Okay, he knew exactly where he was. He knew what type of people he's dealing with. One of my favorite stories of that time that he describes was when one of the officers put a revolver to his head. This was in the middle of a deep interrogation. They wanted information about who was involved in which operations and where in underground. And the officer said to him, Rabbi Schneerson, this toy has made many people speak. Talk or I'll blow your brains out. Well, I don't know exactly those words, and it was in Russian, right? And the Rebbe's response to him was, that toy can intimidate somebody who believes in just this world and more than one God. But I believe in only one God and more than just this world. And that was his guiding principle in life. It was to realize that it's not only about the reality it is right now, but to see that there's a higher meaning, a purpose, an opportunity for transcendence in this very difficulty. So sitting in his dungeon, in his jail cell there, he looked up at Moshe. The very same snake that we read in the Parsha and the epidemic that was giving its venom that was causing the terrible plague amongst the Jews. It also became a source of healing. As God said to Moshe, look up at the pole, right? It will become a sense of a source of healing and strength. There he is in jail, seeing Moshe up on the mountain. And I think if we could all take that message and lesson in life from today, and hopefully if you saw that video, if you want to see it again, you could just find it on Chabad.org. Just search, it's called Embers, and there's many other such videos. I just showed you that one because it was a nice short one to describe the rejuvenation, the change. And I think without that vision, it wouldn't have happened. The Rebbe had that vision. He saw that there'll be better times in Russia. So hopefully by now we're all warmed up and no longer so cold as it was in Russia. As we were actually in Russia, it's probably nice and hot today. It's summer there. But with that, my friends, we'll go. And please God, we'll continue tomorrow. I'm thinking tomorrow's shiur. I came across an interesting article early this morning on Chabad.org. If you want, you could read it. And I'm thinking to do a little shiur about that. And the article is about the history of rabbinics. And what's interesting about that is, let me just find it quickly. Where did it go? Here we go. What is a rabbi? A brief history of rabbinic ordination of smicha. So I was reading the article and I thought that would make a very interesting shiur. Of course, it's related to the parsha as well. That's why they featured it this week. because the parsha talks about how Moshe passed on the baton of leadership from himself to his successor, to Joshua. So hopefully that will be the shiur tomorrow, because people have previously asked me about how does it work? What is this whole process of becoming a rabbi and being a rabbi? So I hope to take that article and go through some of the sources and discuss them together tomorrow. If you want, you could read the article as well. And we'll discuss it tomorrow. We'll go through that article. I will try to use the sources as the text, which we could discuss. And if we'll have time to put together a little presentation about it, just to analyze, I'm sure it will be very interesting for all of us. So looking forward. Until then, Sei gesund. See you tomorrow.
Rabbi. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
Pleasure. Be well, everyone. See you tomorrow.
Thank you.